Welcome to Life Stories, where today, a 70-year-old woman gets left behind at a gas station by her own family. But what they didn't know was that she held the deed to their house, and a truth powerful enough to burn everything down. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about what happens when love is turned into leverage, and how one woman refused to be written off as disposable. You might think you know how this ends, but trust me, you don't. Let's go back to the moment it all began. Eleanor Blake didn't look like the kind of woman you'd forget. Even at 70, she had a quiet dignity about her, shoulders drawn back, silver hair swept into a no-nonsense chignon, eyes sharp enough to cut through excuses. She favored pressed linen slacks and soft cashmere sweaters, the kind that whispered class without trying. Strangers often mistook her for a retired judge or a professor emerita. But what she had always been was a mother. The kind who knew the exact tone of cry that meant her son had scraped a knee versus the one that meant he'd broken a bone. The kind who gave too much and asked too little. She was sipping weak gas station coffee from a paper cup, seated at a wobbly metal table beside a rack of beef jerky and keychains shaped like the Rocky Mountains, when the post appeared on her phone. My children left me at a rest stop. I'm 75 years old and they drove away like I was luggage they forgot. A kind stranger gave me a ride, but the betrayal, that's the part that still hasn't healed. The comments beneath the post surged with outrage. How could anyone do that to their mother? What kind of monsters leave an elderly woman behind? Eleanor read every word in silence, her fingers trembling slightly. But it wasn't the cruelty of the story that made her chest tighten like a vice. It was the fact that she was sitting in that exact same gas station 3 days after her own son had done the exact same thing. Jason and Lauren had left her here, on the side of Highway 85, without so much as a goodbye. But there was something they didn't know. Something that hadn't quite fit into their little narrative of a burdensome grandmother who talked too much about old books and didn't understand how things worked anymore. Eleanor Blake wasn't just someone they could abandon like an old suitcase. She was the legal holder of the deed to the very house they lived in. She took another sip of her coffee, now lukewarm, and looked out the glass door to the dusty parking lot. There was no mistaking it. The silver SUV that had disappeared down the highway 3 days ago had carried everything she had packed: her medication, her suitcase, even the sketchbooks she'd bought for Ava and the new soccer cleats for Miles. And yet, she was still here. Breathing. Planning. Watching. It hadn't always been like this. Just 6 months ago, she had been happily retired in a quiet Arizona condo, spending her days reading, tending to her roses, and catching the occasional matinee with her sister Margot, who lived a few hours north in Boulder. Life was simple, and she liked it that way. Then Jason called. His voice had cracked in that familiar, childlike way. Mom, I didn't know who else to turn to. Lauren lost her job, the mortgage is behind, and the kids can't lose their home. Not again. Of course she'd said yes. She'd said yes before she even finished her tea. Of course she'd pulled $80,000 from her late husband's life insurance fund. She made Jason sign a simple legal agreement, nothing dramatic, just something her husband would have insisted on. The house would remain in her name until the loan was repaid in 2 years. Jason had hesitated but signed. The first few months were golden. Jason called every Sunday. Ava texted her drawings. Lauren even sent a heartfelt thank you message. But slowly, the warmth turned to frost. Calls went unanswered. Visits were bad timing. When Eleanor showed up unannounced for Tyler's birthday, she was met with forced smiles and a sparkling dinner party for which there was, miraculously, no seat for her. Still, she hadn't expected this. She never imagined that the culmination of her motherhood, decades of sacrifice and late-night fevers and birthday cakes with handmade frosting, would end with her sitting alone at a rest stop next to a stale coffee dispenser and a vending machine that ate her last $5 bill. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the performance. Because what Eleanor had realized, what chilled her more than the cold mountain air, was that the abandonment hadn't been a burst of frustration or a spur-of-the-moment argument. It had been planned. The spontaneous family road trip. The car breaking down just long enough for her to stretch her legs. The vague talk about finances over lunch. And then the sudden disappearance after she went to the bathroom. Her phone had been left charging in the car. Her wallet was with her, yes, but her ID? In her suitcase. They knew exactly what they were doing. That night, a young attendant named Jake noticed her sitting alone and offered her help. He gave her his manager's office line. He called Margot, who dropped everything and drove 3 hours through the mountains to get her. When Margot finally arrived, cheeks flushed, jaw-tight, Eleanor told her everything. The story poured out between sips of hot cocoa like blood from a reopened wound. Margot had looked her in the eye and said, "You are not going back to being their doormat. Not after this." That had been 3 days ago. Since then, Eleanor had met with a lawyer, unearthed Jason's financial records, and found something even darker than she expected. This wasn't the first time Jason and Lauren had borrowed large sums from an elderly relative under false pretenses. But none of that compared to what she had just discovered 15 minutes ago. Sitting in this very booth, skimming her bank app to cancel her compromised cards, she noticed 2 new charges: a $600 luxury electronics purchase, and a $350 dinner at a steakhouse in Boulder. Charges made after she'd been left at this gas station. Jason and Lauren hadn't just abandoned her. They were actively using her credit card while she sat there with a vending machine dinner and a single bar of cell service. A low, cold anger bubbled up in Eleanor's chest. It wasn't grief. Not anymore. It was clarity. They had underestimated her confused compassion for weakness, love for naivete. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they'd been. Have you ever trusted someone so much you didn't see the betrayal coming until it hit you like a car on a cold highway? Do you believe there's a point where forgiveness becomes enabling and standing up for yourself becomes the only love that matters? Because as Eleanor Blake stood from that table, the coffee forgotten and her hands steady at last, she made a decision that would change everything. And what came next would shock everyone who thought the story was already over. The air in Margot's kitchen was thick with the scent of strong coffee and sharper truths. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, not for warmth but to stop them from shaking. Margot moved with purpose, measuring sugar with a fury that suggested she would rather be smashing something than stirring it. "They used your credit card after they left you?" Margot asked, her voice taut. Eleanor nodded. "At a steakhouse, no less. Medium rare, on my dime." Margot muttered something under her breath that Eleanor chose not to ask her to repeat. "They didn't just forget me," Eleanor said softly. "They planned this. They timed it. And now they're stealing from me while telling their kids I walked away." Margot turned, arms crossed. "So what are you going to do, Elle?" Eleanor looked up. The steel in her gaze was new. "I'm going to burn it all down. But carefully. Legally. And with receipts." That afternoon, they drove to meet with Margaret Jensen, Eleanor's attorney, a whip-smart woman in her late 50s with a reputation for shredding manipulative estate cases like tissue paper. Eleanor handed her the signed agreement. Margaret read it once, then again, slower. "You hold a lien on their home," she confirmed. "And based on these fraudulent charges, you also have grounds for reporting identity theft and financial elder abuse." Eleanor felt both vindicated and hollow. "I never wanted this." "No," Margaret said, "but you didn't want to be abandoned at a gas station either." The plan unfolded like a precise, clinical operation. Margaret would issue a formal demand for repayment in 30 days. Failure to comply would trigger foreclosure proceedings. But it was more than the house. Eleanor also agreed to press charges for the credit card fraud charges that could open a formal investigation into Jason and Lauren's financial behavior. What Margaret didn't know, and what Eleanor hadn't admitted even to herself yet, was the fear simmering under the resolve. Because she still loved him. Jason, her only son, the child she'd once carried through measles, bad dreams, and prom rejections. The boy who had cried when he lost his first pet and kissed her hand when he got his college acceptance letter. Somewhere, beneath the bitterness, that boy still existed. Didn't he? "Are you sure you're ready for what this will do to your relationship?" Margaret asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. "We don't have a relationship." He turned it into a transaction. "I'm just finally giving it a price." That night, alone in Margot's guest bedroom, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling. Photos of Ava and Miles still haunted her phone. Miles with his gap-toothed grin on the soccer field. Ava in a smock, holding up a watercolor of a family she believed loved her. Did they even know why Grandma had vanished? She imagined Ava asking, "Why didn't Grandma come back?" And Jason answering, "Because she cared more about money than family." It wasn't just betrayal Eleanor was fighting. It was erasure. The next morning, Eleanor received a voicemail from Jason. She played it on speaker as Margot made eggs. "Mom. Look, we need to talk. This letter from your lawyer, it's insane. You know we've had a rough year. You know we're trying. Please, let's not turn this into something ugly. Think about the kids. Don't do this to them." Eleanor closed her eyes, willing the words to land like bullets instead of bait. Don't do this to them, as if she were the one uprooting their lives. "Same guilt, different wrapping," Margot said, flipping eggs. "He knows exactly where to stab." Then came the second voicemail, this one from an unfamiliar number. "This is Sarah Chen with Colorado Child Services. Mrs. Blake, we've received the report concerning a recent incident involving your grandchildren, Ava and Miles. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you directly. Please call me back as soon as possible." Margot stopped mid-motion. What the hell is this? Eleanor's hand trembled as she hit redial. When she reached Sarah Chen, the caseworker was calm but firm. "Mrs. Blake, the report claims that you became erratic during a recent family trip, walked off during a stop on Highway 85, and left your grandchildren in a distressed state. Their parents have expressed concern about your mental state." Eleanor felt the air drain from the room. "They're saying I left them?" "Yes, ma'am. And until we resolve the matter, all contact between you and the children will need to be supervised." It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was war. Jason and Lauren weren't content with erasing her, they were rewriting the story with her as the villain. Eleanor's vision narrowed. She was no longer just fighting for money, or even dignity. She was fighting for her memory. For her grandchildren's version of her. And in that moment, something inside Eleanor shifted. No longer grief or rage, but precision. A deep, sharpened clarity. The kind that comes when a woman realizes she's not just being attacked, she's being rewritten. She stood slowly, with a composure that felt eerily calm. "Margot," she said, "call that investigator you mentioned. The one who used to be a cop." Margot blinked. "You sure?" Eleanor's voice didn't waver. "If they want a war, we'll give them one. But this time, We keep the receipts. How far would you go to protect the truth, especially when the people you love are trying to bury it under lies? Because the next move Eleanor Blake makes won't just change her story, it will expose a truth powerful enough to destroy everything Jason and Lauren have tried to hide. The knock on the door came just before dusk. Eleanor stood in the kitchen of her new rental, a modest but sunlit space in Boulder, close enough to Margot's that they could walk over with a bottle of wine and a story. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, heart thudding with the rhythm of something she couldn't yet name. When she opened the door, it wasn't Jason. It wasn't Lauren. It was Ava. 12 years old, hair in a braid, wearing the same hoodie Eleanor had bought her last Christmas. Behind her stood Sarah Chen, the caseworker from Child Services. "Hi, Grandma," Ava said softly, holding out a drawing. It was of a woman sitting alone on a bench, trees rustling around her, sunlight falling like gold over her shoulders. In the bottom corner, Ava had written in looping cursive, asterisk. She waited. "And we came back, asterisk." "I missed you," Ava whispered. Eleanor pulled her into a hug so tight the air around them seemed to pause. Sarah nodded approvingly. "The supervised visit can begin now." 1 hour. 1 hour. Eleanor hadn't cried in weeks. Not when she'd filed the formal fraud charges. Not when the private investigator had delivered the hard drive with screen recordings of Jason and Lauren Googling how to forge dementia diagnosis. Not even when Margaret had filed the court motion to force the foreclosure. But this quiet moment on a doorstep, with Ava breathing against her chest, undid her completely. Inside, they sat at the dining table. Eleanor offered Ava cookies and milk, then hesitated. "Does your father, does he know you're here?" Ava shrugged. "He said I shouldn't see you right now. That you're mad at him." "I am," Eleanor said gently. "But I'm never mad at you." Ava looked at her, wide-eyed. "Did you really leave us at the gas station?" "No, sweetheart. They left me." Ava didn't ask why. She just nodded, as if some part of her had always known. "I heard Daddy yelling last night. He said you're taking the house. That you're trying to ruin us." Eleanor set her mug down carefully. "I'm trying to make things right. That doesn't always look nice from the outside." The caseworker stood by the window, pretending to check her phone, giving them a sliver of privacy. The sun dipped lower, spilling a warm glow across the room, like forgiveness trying to sneak in quietly. The next week, the court issued a protective order in Eleanor's favor. Margaret called her with the news. Jason and Lauren were officially under investigation for felony elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. The lien on the house was enforced. Eleanor had the right to foreclose. "They're lawyering up," Margaret warned. "But our case is airtight. The text messages, the surveillance footage, the forged receipts, it's over." And yet, Eleanor didn't feel triumphant. She felt like she'd buried something sacred just to protect what was left of it. The twist came in the form of a letter. Handwritten. No return address. It arrived one morning in a plain white envelope, slipped through the door slot like a ghost. It was from Jason. The handwriting was familiar, rushed, but no longer careless. There was no apology, not really. Just one sentence near the end that stopped her cold. Asterisk, "I know you'll win. You always did when it mattered. But tell the kids I tried." Asterisk. She read that line 3 times, unsure if it was a confession or a goodbye. 2 days later, Lauren was arrested at a Denver restaurant, just after ordering a bottle of wine on a credit card Eleanor hadn't used in months. Jason was nowhere to be found. They found his car at the edge of a hiking trail just outside Estes Park. Inside was a photo of Ava and Miles, a baseball glove, and a flash drive labeled for Mom. On the drive, There were spreadsheets, evidence of the scams he and Lauren had been part of. Names, accounts, dates. But there was also a video. Jason, sitting in their kitchen, staring into the lens with a weariness Eleanor recognized too well. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I just want you to understand that I wasn't always like this. I used to believe I was good. But one compromise led to another, and then I stopped recognizing the man shaving in the mirror. You were always the moral compass, Mom. And I stopped listening. I'm sorry I broke your heart. I just didn't know how to be better." The screen went black. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough. But it was something. The following spring, Eleanor bought a small 2-story home with a backyard swing and a garden that needed love. She and Margot planted tulips with Ava and Miles one Saturday, their knees dirty, their laughter real. Ava came to stay every other weekend. Miles, once quiet and unsure, had started leaving drawings on Eleanor's fridge. They didn't talk about the gas station. They didn't talk about Jason's disappearance. But sometimes, Eleanor would find them staring out the window like they were waiting for a car that might come back. She never told them not to hope. One morning, as she walked Ava to the bus stop, the girl looked up and said, "Grandma, you know what I figured out." "What, sweetheart?" "You didn't just save yourself. You saved us, too. Even Daddy if he ever decides to come back." Eleanor kissed her forehead. "I hope he does. But until then, we're going to be okay." As the bus pulled away, Eleanor stood alone in the morning chill, watching the future she had almost lost wave to her through a glass window. She had chosen truth over silence, boundaries over guilt. And in doing so, she had rewritten the ending of her own story. Not as the woman left behind, but as the woman who refused to stay forgotten. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that truly stayed with you? Type 100 in the comments if the story moved you. We'd love to know, what country are you watching from? Share this video with someone you care about. And thank you for watching Life Stories.